There's an Arctic blast sweeping in from the north this week. I hope you've got your long johns ready. Things are about to get just a little chillier. Down in Mar-a-Lago, they're still celebrating. But the president-elect's threatening to freeze trade with the rest of the world, including us. Come wind or high water, he's not moving from his budget plan. Not this week, anyway. Farmers are furious. The government's giving them the cold shoulder, they say. Get ready for empty shelves in the supermarkets. The gentleman's not for turning, but could the Prime Minister's hand be forced by the farmers? We'll talk inheritance tax, buses and assisted dying with the Transport Secretary, Louise Haigh. Plus, when does a hate incident become a hate crime? That's a million-dollar question hanging over policing this week. We'll discuss it with the new Shadow Home Secretary, Philp. Justin Welby may be out of a job, but today a major intervention from the only bishop who publicly called for his resignation. The Bishop of Newcastle tells this programme a culture of fear and careerism is preventing bishops from calling out the Church of England leadership. And as thousands of farmers protest the Chancellor's tax-raising budget, will they really leave us with empty shelves? The head of the National Farmers Union, Tom Bradshaw, joins us live. And with us throughout the show, The Spectator's assistant editor, Cindy Yu, former Home Office Special Advisor, Salma Shah, and The Observer's chief leader writer, Sonia Soda. Welcome to Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. Economists say that when America sneezes, the world catches a cold. Right now, most of the globe is holding its breath and reaching for its masks, just in case. The incoming Trump administration hasn't said much, but some of the president-elect's cabinet nominees offer a clue to his direction of travel. Let's leave aside handing the health department to a guy who doesn't think the COVID vaccine works, or the legal brief to a politician under investigation by Congress. Some people think putting a Sunday morning political talk show host in charge of the mightiest military machine ever assembled feels a bit of a risk. Personally, I can't see the problem. Anyway, the chances are that not all of these nominees will make it through the congressional confirmation process. But the rapid appointment of a China hawk, Marco Rubio, to the State Department, and a climate change skeptic, oil and gas executive to the Energy Department, are signs that Mr. Trump isn't in a mood to moderate his message. And with a battle-hardened campaign boss, Susie Wiles, at his side as White House Chief of Staff, we can expect this administration to be a far more disciplined political machine than the last time Mr. Trump occupied the Oval Office. In short, the prospects are that Trump 47 may be just as radical in tone as Trump 45, but this time he does know what he's doing. Let's start closer to home this morning. Earlier, I spoke to the Transport Secretary, Louise Haigh. Secretary of State, is it true that the government's negotiating migration deals with Libya, Tunisia, Kurdistan?
Well, the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary have made no secret that this is an international problem that needs international solutions, and that's why both of them have been working with our counterparts across Europe and across the world to make sure that we have deals and agreements in place that can tackle this issue. We can't tackle it on our own at the border. That's why the Prime Minister was at Interpol recently talking about exactly this issue. And we need to tackle the problem upstream. Just last week, the biggest supplier of small boat engines, one of the biggest suppliers, was arrested in the Netherlands and deported to Belgium. And that was a direct consequence of cooperation between the National Crime Agency and its counterparts. And that's exactly what we mean by this kind of operation.
So that's a yes. We are thinking about working with third countries in various ways. Why is this different to Rwanda?
Well, Rwanda was a failed gimmick that managed to solve absolutely nothing.
That's because you scrapped it. Why is it different? You're working with another country to help deal with this problem internationally. Why is this such a big difference?
Well, Rwanda wasn't working well before we scrapped it on coming into office. It was costing the taxpayer a fortune. It clearly wasn't working as a deterrent, and it wasn't resolving the issue at source. What we're talking about is resolving the issue upstream. So tackling and smashing the gangs, as Keir Starmer has repeatedly talked about, in order to stop the boats coming over at all. The Rwanda scheme wasn't deterring boats.
But if I may say so, I'm asking you about these particular potential deals, Vietnam and Kurdistan. Lots of countries are doing this. How much is it going to cost you?
Well, I'm not going to talk on about individual deals or operational deals, but what I can say is this absolutely characterises our approach, working with international partners in a long-term, serious way, not attempting headline-grabbing distractions, which was all that the Rwanda scheme was, and it failed to stop a single small boat or remove a single individual.
Yeah, but you're still going to end up spending some hundreds of millions on this, aren't you? Well,
we're wasting hundreds of millions at the moment with hotel accommodation, with a failed system that is failing to tackle the problem. Yvette Cooper is a serious person, a serious Home Secretary that is committed to working with our international partners in order to tackle the problem in the long term.
All right, the Prime Minister didn't go abroad, went to Wales yesterday. Why did he not have anything in his speech that held out hope to the farming community that the things that they object to, particularly the changes to inheritance tax, might be alleviated?
Well, I think what Keir Starmer set out to our Welsh Labour conference yesterday was a defence of the budget. And look, none of us came into politics in order to leverage tax on the farming community, but we were left with a very difficult fiscal inheritance, as the Chancellor and lots of my colleagues will have spoken to your viewers about, that left us with a 22 billion black hole. In transport alone, I inherited nearly £3 billion of unfunded transport projects and pressures. And that has led to difficult decisions.
Your colleagues have told me that many times, but what I really want to know is, why did he have nothing to say to farmers yesterday? They were gathered, they're demonstrating. From what their leaders say, they're hurting. Prime Minister had nothing to say to them.
Well, colleagues have met with representatives of the farming community, and we do understand concerns. We appreciate how hard farmers work. I've got people in my own circle of family and friends that work extraordinarily hard in farming and earn very little as a result. But these decisions had to be made, and we think they've been made in a fair and proportionate way in order to fund public services. What I would say, in order to address the exact question about what we've got to offer farmers...
But the money you're talking about is just a few million. And if I may say so, is it wise for the farming minister to respond to the anger of farmers by telling them to calm down, which is apparently what he's done?
Well, I don't think we would use exact language like that.
That's what he said. He said, look at this calmly. Perhaps you might want to correct the tone of that a little bit.
We absolutely recognise the enormous contribution that farmers make to our economy and to feeding the nation, and we've recognised that actually through our New Deal for Farmers, which Steve Reed, the Environment Secretary, has set out, which includes reforming our procurement rules to require 50% of food in our public spaces, public sector, to be produced by British farmers. This will be an enormous boost to the farming industry. Also set out protections for them with future trade deals and bringing down energy bills. This will be transformative for a lot of farmers across the country. So we do recognise the difficult situation that many are in, but we think the choices that we've set out in the budget are fair and proportionate.
If I can use a food metaphor, that feels like jam tomorrow. What the farmers are bothered about, what's happening today, and they're going to respond today. Are you concerned about the prospect of empty shelves as we enter the winter months?
No, we think we put forward food security really as a priority, and we'll work with farmers and the supply chain in order to ensure that. But the changes that we've made...
you and they just say, you know, you've dropped it on us. We are going to show you, as they seem to be saying, we're going to show you how valuable we are by making sure that you understand what happens if we don't have the family farms that you're about to wreck.
I think what we need to do is look at this in the round and see that, as I say, the Environment Secretary has set out a major package of measures that will support all farmers. These tax measures are applied to farms that are worth over £1 million and only in inheritance tax situations. Yeah. And even when inheritance tax is applied, it's set at half what everyone else would apply on
We've heard
threshold.
that. They clearly don't believe you, but just let's deal with a practical point. If I may let's say, do a public service announcement. Can you assure us that the government has contingency plans in place to make sure that we don't have food shortages if the farmers carry out their threats to ratchet up action?
Well, of course, the Department for Environment and Food and Rural Affairs will be setting out plans for the winter and setting out. Will, as business as usual, be setting out contingency plans and ensuring that food security is treated as the priority it deserves to be.
All right, let's move on to your own territory, which is buses. You're talking about your plan to invest in buses. I'll come to that in a second. Can I just get one thing clear? Is it the government's intention to keep the £3 cap on bus fares beyond next year?
So the plans that we inherited would have ended the cap completely on the 31st of December. We've stepped in with funding to protect it at £3 until the 31st of December next year. And in that period, we'll look to establish more targeted approaches. We've, through evaluation of the £2 cap, found that the best approach is to target it at young people. So we want to look at ways in order to ensure more targeted ways, just like we do with the concessionary fare for older people. We think we can develop more targeted ways that will better encourage people onto buses.
Oh, that's interesting.
And be better value for
so
money.
After 31st of December 2025, the expectation should be that we won't have a single cap, but you might try to find ways in which, as you put it, you can target subsidy bus relief on bus fares at particular groups of people?
That's what we're considering at the moment as we go through this year, as we have that time whilst the £3 cap is in place, because the evaluation that we had showed it hadn't represented good value for money, the previous cap. We want to protect rural routes, which we've done through the £3 cap, and we want to protect young people and older people. But we want to make sure that buses are available, that they are reliable, because actually it's the reliability of buses that keeps most people off them. If you live in a lot of small towns or villages, you've not got a bus before 9 a.m. or after 5 p.m. Okay. And that's what stops people catching the bus, and that's what is behind our announcement today. Your
announcement is for a £1 billion cash boost for bus travel, and you're putting it into various schemes. Is that £1 billion over and above the £930 million that last government committed in, I think, a project it was called Network North, or is that the same money?
Well, the money that was announced in Network North wasn't committed, it wasn't agreed, and when I entered office there wasn't any budget for buses. So the billion that we're announcing today is entirely new money, and entirely new money agreed by the Treasury. So the previous government could go around announcing any kind of figures it wants, but until it was in the budget and or in a spending review, then it wasn't destined.
So just to be clear, is that the Network North project, which I think dealt with, was going to give money to, for example, Blackburn. Is that gone now? That's scrapped?
It never existed in the first place, Trevor. I'm sure you know that. If you go around announcing money that hasn't been agreed by the Treasury...
Yeah, but if you talk to somebody in this business in Blackburn, I think they expected to see the, whatever it was, £700 million heading their way. So they're going to be disappointed now, aren't they?
Well, no, because today we have announced, through the budget, we have announced that they are getting it. And actually what we've done with this pot of money is devise a formula that sits behind it, that is fair, that is transparent, and that means that every part of the country gets it. You know, the previous government had funding streams that were competitive. They required people to spend money on bid writers and writing applications, and then some people got nothing out of it. We have devised a formula that sits behind the funding that is based on population.
So but to be absolutely clear, all those people who thought they were going to get money out of the Network North project, are you saying that that's all gone and that maybe some of them will, some of them won't, or are you saying they will get the money under your new scheme?
Well, we're announcing today £1 billion of bus funding, so that's more than was.
Yeah, but the people who are expecting money that the Tories promised them, doesn't matter whether it was funded or not, the Tories promised them this money. Are they going to get the money or not?
They are getting the money. They are getting money that we're announcing today, and we're setting out.
So why is it a new scheme?
That everyone's getting. Well, we're setting out a fair formula behind it. And like I say, there was no money out of Network North. It was nonsense.
Okay.
It wasn't funded. It wasn't agreed by the Treasury. It wasn't set out in a budget or a spending review. And the budget I inherited didn't include any money allocated to buses. So this is all new money that's been negotiated by the Treasury. And as I say, it's allocated on a fair basis. It means places like Blackburn, like Devon, like Kent, like Essex are getting an enormous uplift in both capital and revenue for their bus services, which will be transformative.
The big gorilla in your garden is HS2. Is it actually going to run to Crewe?
No, HS2 will not run to Crewe. HS2 phase 1 will be delivered, which is Birmingham to Euston.
So Birmingham to Crewe and all that, forget it.
So it's running to Birmingham.
Andy Burnham's going to be disappointed.
So we're working with Andy Burnham and Richard Parker, the Mayor of the West Midlands, and actually I'm meeting them both tomorrow to discuss what needs to be done north of Birmingham. But I'm very clear, we're not resurrecting the plans for HS2, and HS2 Limited isn't getting any further work beyond what's been commissioned to Euston. All
right. There is a major private member's bill coming to the House of Commons shortly on the what we must describe as physician-assisted suicide. How will you vote?
I am still considering. It's a matter of public record that I voted in favour last time, and that is where I am leaning, if I, totally honestly. But I am really conscious that there are concerns, particularly from disabled advocacy groups, around and concerns around palliative care. So I am considering that. I think this is a really important moment for the country as a whole to reflect. I don't think anybody should, for a second, think that as MPs we don't take this decision seriously, and it's a very, very difficult decision that I am weighing up on both sides. So
are you concerned, as your Cabinet colleague Wes Streeting is, about the absence of palliative care, as he puts it anyway?
I think we can all acknowledge that palliative care isn't in as good a state as it should be. So I am listening to those concerns, but I also don't think this is an either or, and that's why I'm weighing up all those representations. I'm very conscious that people have very strong views on both sides, and I'm talking to my constituents about it.
We'll be playing an interview a little later with the Bishop of Newcastle, in which she reflects on the resignation of the Archbishop of Canterbury. She claims that a culture of silence and fear in the upper ranks of the Church of England is part of the reason that the abuse that we've now learned about was not identified earlier. Is this doing, if you like, irreparable damage to the Church and its place, for example, in Parliament? Well, I mean, first and foremost, I think we have to think about the victims of this horrific set of crimes, and it's appalling that only now is this properly coming to light and people are talking about it in the way that they are, and the issues that it undoubtedly arises for the Church of England. I think we have to listen to Bishop Helen, and we have to accept that that is true. If she's saying that, that's how she feels, then the Church absolutely needs to act on it. And as a member of the Church of England myself, I want to see the Church acting on it in a transparent way. Secretary of State, thank you very much for your time this morning. Thank you. Let's see what our panel made of all that. We're joined all morning by the Spectator's Assistant Editor, Cindy Yu, former Home Office Special Advisor, Salma Shah, and the Observer's Chief Leader Writer, Sonia Soda. Salma, farmers, how big a danger is this to the Starmer administration?
Well, it's dangerous. It's a dangerous situation. Is it going to derail the Starmer administration? No, but it's a huge problem that has occurred. I think losing the farmers so early for a Labour government is a bad sign if you think about how you're supposed to be reaching out across the electoral divide. I also think that there is a fundamental misunderstanding, and the farmers' issue underlines this, about what wealth actually is in this country. And the fact that the taxes have gone after land-owning people doesn't necessarily translate into the reality of farmers' circumstances. And I think there is this sort of misunderstanding. And if you don't get the tone right of that and fix it and perhaps go for a U-turn, I think this is something that's destined to repeat itself in policy and tax terms down the line.
So the big majority that Labour has potentially is part of the problem here, because Labour now has a lot of MPs in places that they're not used to having them, i.e. rural areas with, guess what, a load of farmers in them.
Yes, and they've also now got a lot of MPs who have pretty slim majorities who are anxiously looking forward to the next election. I do think, though, I think this fight was inevitable. If Labour wanted to raise more from inheritance tax by removing some of the exemptions, lots of people, lots of chancellors have looked at this before and have decided not to do it because of the political fight that would ensue. It was always inevitable there was going to be this fight. I think there's an element of which, well, at least it's farmers and not pensioners in some ways. You know, we saw the sort of earlier struggles around the way that the means testing of winter fuel payment was announced. But it is uncomfortable. I think it speaks to just how awful the economic inheritance for Rachel Reeves was, and the fact that they were willing to have this political fight, an entirely foreseeable one, for what some people might say is actually, you know, fairly incremental in terms of the extra inheritance tax take from the grand scheme of things when you're looking at the government's budget. I think it shows just how tight things were and just how much Rachel had to look at, you know, tax rises that previous chancellors have turned down because they didn't want these kinds of politics.
Cindy, I sort of feel ancient here because I'm remembering now the Countryside Alliance, which turned out, 1 million people against policies of a previous Labour government and actually just rocked it. Is this going to go away?
I don't think anytime soon, because the government just doesn't sound like they are going to make a U-turn. I mean, but the fact that they are saying that they're going to have another look at the numbers, I think just doesn't bode very well. It's not giving me a huge amount of confidence, because what I find concerning about this policy is the fact that the numbers can't be agreed on. You know, the government says that 3/4 of farmers will not be affected by this exemption being lifted. But the farmers say that 2/3 will be affected. So what has gone wrong in the actual calculation of the impact of this? And if they can't even agree on the numbers, then it feels a bit like the government doesn't really know what the full impact of this massive policy that it's doing. And I disagree with Sonia in the sense of it's not just pensioners or farmers, you know, in the sense that farmers are a productive force in the economy. Exactly. You know, they're not just a voting bloc.
I definitely wouldn't disagree with that. I just think it's better than politically, it's better than a row with
on a political level.
On a political level.
On like a long-term country level, do we really want to be kind of restricting one of the productive forces in this country when we have actually so few?
The issue is, though, is that there are the more exemptions you have on inheritance tax, the easier it is for the very wealthiest to avoid, while the pretty wealthy end up caught up in inheritance tax. And that's really unfair. And the truth of the matter is, you can't get at some of the unfairnesses in the system, which is basically very, very wealthy people buying up farmland in order to avoid inheritance tax, unless you look at some of these exemptions, and there are always going to be trade-offs there. If you look at the director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies and what he says about it, he says it's mad that this exemption exists because it really does allow people to avoid inheritance tax. Now, of course, it has implications for farmers, but, you know, trade-offs, that's what government's about.
I was struck in the interview that I did with Louise Haigh that there seemed to be some sensitivity to the rural vote. I asked her about the £3 cap on bus fares, and she seemed pretty clear that that's gone after the end of next year, because what they want to do is target the money that they have on young voters, and she mentioned rural voters. Do you think that's a sort of indication that Labour is beginning to notice that rural voters are different, want something different?
Well, obviously, rural voters will want something different, but I think what's interesting is what Labour is willing to give up at the next election. So there was always this idea when Boris Johnson sort of pushed out in 2019 and had this huge sort of, you know, red wall victory. What does that do to the changing of the Conservative Party and its policies, and how does that shape things? And arguably, he became a lot, you know, bigger state, wanted to do more spending because he had these red wall seats. Now, the reverse is happening with Labour. What are they going to start doing as a consequence of having them? And critically, what are they thinking about strategically as to what they're willing to give up in this new electoral coalition? And early indications are that they are not quite decided, and so they're still trying to contain what they've won currently.
It feels actually pretty much like every week, Sonia, I come in here and there's another problem for the government. It is a bit odd. 4 months in, they seem to be running into trouble pretty much every week.
Yeah. Well, I think there's two aspects to that. The first is, as I was just saying, the economic inheritance is absolutely unenviable. They've inherited sluggish growth, sluggish productivity. That's partly an issue of long-term structural issues in the British economy. It's partly an issue of things like Brexit as well, and decisions that Conservative chancellors have made, as well as global headwinds. So it's really, really difficult. I think Rachel Reeves did as well as she could in her budget in terms of freeing up more money for public services and borrowing more to invest. But when you look at the OBR projections, that does have an impact on growth, but it comes, mostly after the next election. So I think the lesson for Labour looking at the US election is, centre-left governments, incumbents, when the economy is not doing well, when people don't feel like living standards are going up, they are very willing to go out and punish that government. And I think Labour is now going to be laser focused on the next 4 years. They've got to achieve better growth than the OBR forecast. But it is going to be very difficult because you've got a Trump presidency, potential global trade war, which I know we're going to talk about, potentially higher inflation globally, which actually makes those OBR forecasts perhaps even look on the optimistic rather than the pessimistic side.
The other thing which is just heading down the track, which I think is going to be quite big news over the next few weeks, and I'll stick with you if you don't mind, Sonia, is the assisted dying bill. Prime Minister's basically saying this is an individual decision. But his cabinet doesn't seem to be following the rules. They're supposed to keep stum, but Louise Haigh this morning was pretty clear. She's going to vote for it.
Yeah, well, it's very difficult on an issue like this to basically get the Cabinet to say nothing, particularly when it has consequences for people's own departments. I think it's very significant that Shaban Mahmood, the Justice Secretary, huge implications cost-wise for the Justice Department in terms of judicial sign-off. Wes Streeting, big implications for his department. In fact, if the bill passes, the bill says the Secretary of State has to outline, there's all kinds of details that are just missing from the bill that the Secretary of State has to outline in terms of regulations. He's got to set up new monitoring systems for the chief medical officers. So it's not really sustainable to think that cabinet ministers can't talk about an issue that directly affects their brief. And the issue is that Starmer himself said that he wanted this vote to happen. He said he made a promise to Esther Ranson. So he's not really dealing with it quite as neutrally as he seems to want his cabinet to. And the other thing is that the rules say that if it's a private member's bill and the cabinet is going to agree collective neutrality, it needs to do it on the basis of an impact assessment. Has there been one? The fact that Wes Streeting has commissioned his own department suggests there hasn't been one. So something's gone wrong in the process around this.
Do we think that this is going to be a problem, or is it going to just go away? I mean, the sense is that actually might not get through.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's a problem for the government in the sense of if Keir Starmer wants it to get through, because we think privately does actually agree with legalising some kind of assisted dying. And this is not the best way to go about it. I mean, the fact that it came through a private member's bill, perhaps the government couldn't really help that. And the process that happened since then has meant that there's just not been enough impact assessments, discussions. Even the debate itself is only 5 hours long. So it just doesn't feel like the right way to approach such a tricky topic.
What do you think, Salma?
So I agree. I also think that if you do have a position on it, there's no point in forcing cabinet neutrality, because part of that discussion, part of that debate, as Sonia says, must involve the department. But also, I think we all have a right to know where cabinet ministers and the Prime Minister is on this issue. Yes, it's an issue of conscience. Yes, it's an issue of where your morals might be, where your ethics might be. But we, as the public, have a right to know where people stand and what their arguments are, because if they do vote in favour, I mean, I'm personally against it, but if they do vote in favour, I would like to hear the arguments.
And I think one other question is, there have been reports that actually Number 10 were pushing this behind the scenes and wanted this private members' bill to be taken up. And there's the substantive issues, like Salma, I'm against it on the basis that this bill doesn't have sure enough safeguards. But on the political issue, why did Starmer want this debate to happen in the first few months? It seems like a crazy decision politically. He should have done it in a different way.
OK, well, maybe next time Cabinet Ministers on next week before the vote. They'll tell us. It is coming up to 9 o'clock. You're watching Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. In the last half hour, the Transport Secretary's told us the government's looking to replace the £3 bus cap with more targeted support, specifically for younger people. She also defended the introduction of inheritance tax on farmers as fair and proportionate, adding contingency plans are in place if farmers stop supplying our supermarkets. Well, do stay with us. In a moment, we'll hear from the Shadow Home Secretary, Philp. Plus, as thousands of farmers protest the Chancellor's budget, we'll be joined live by the head of the National Farmers Union, Tom Bradshaw. And dramatic allegations from Senior Bishop Dr. Helen-Ann Hartle. She tells this programme a culture of fear and careerism is preventing her colleagues from criticising Church of England leadership.
Silence speaks in many ways. Some are silent perhaps because they see themselves as succeeding to be the new Archbishop of Canterbury. Others are fearful of being reprimanded and rebuked.
We'll bring you that full interview with the Bishop of Newcastle shortly. But before that, let's hear from the Conservatives. A little earlier, I spoke to the new Shadow Home Secretary, Philp. Philp, Louise Haigh told me this morning pretty clearly that the government is contemplating paying countries like Vietnam and Kurdistan in a deal to keep migrants away from Britain. Would you support such a deal?
Yes, we'd support any plan which cuts or stops the illegal crossings over the English Channel. In fact, what they're proposing appears to build on work the previous Conservative government had already been doing, so we would support that. However, on its own, it clearly won't be enough. What we need is a deterrent, and that is why it was such a huge mistake for the incoming Labour government to cancel the Rwanda deterrent scheme before it had even started. It was due to start on the 24th of July. They cancelled it. And in the absence of that deterrent, of course, people are going to keep crossing. And that is why numbers crossing the English Channel have gone up significantly since Labour came to office.
But you bunged away something north of 500 million on the Rwanda scheme. Now you're going to support something which some people might say is just throwing good money after bad.
Well, look, we need to stop these crossings and we'll constructively support the government where they have initiatives. But the initiatives they're announcing are not going to be enough. They are not on their own going to work because I think as the National Crime Agency themselves have said, as even Martin Hewitt, their new border czar, has said, you need a deterrent as well, and that means removing people who have arrived here illegally.
But if Rwanda was a deterrent, why isn't a deal with Kurdistan or Turkey going to be equally a deterrent?
Well, they're completely different things. So just to be clear, they are not proposing, as far as I can see, to return people, have a returns agreement with those countries. They're proposing to work with those countries to prevent departures in the first place. Okay. Now, that's all well and good. I'm, perfectly happy to support that, but it's not going to work as a deterrent. To deter people, they need to know that if they illegally and dangerously cross the English Channel, they are going to be immediately removed somewhere else, and that's what Rwanda did. And these deals don't do that.
You're talking about the deterrent, but actually, whereas Rwanda basically only got 4 people, I think, most of them members of government, to go to Rwanda, the Italian scheme has cut the boat crossings into Italy by, I think, 62%. This sounds like a better bet, don't you think?
Oh, first of all, the Rwanda scheme never actually started. It was due to start on the 24th of July.
And you spent 700 million on it.
And it would have saved us a lot of money had it been started, because the deterrent would have stopped people crossing the English Channel. We know that because it worked in Australia. Now, you mentioned the Libya deal. Now, that's a little bit different, because what Italy did with Libya was stop people departing from the coast of Libya in the direction of the small islands. I think Lampedusa is one, and the Italian mainland. That is not what Labour is currently proposing. They're not proposing to stop people embarking from France. They're trying to stop people leaving Vietnam or Kurdistan in the first place. Now, that's all well and good, but it won't stop the boats, whereas our Rwanda scheme would have done, and that's why the Labour Party were wrong to cancel it before it even started.
But just to be clear, you will support it, even if it's not.
Look, it's a constructive step, but it's not going to fix the problem on its own.
Let's talk about the farmers. We know that you back the farmers on inheritance tax, but are you happy about their tactics, threatening to empty the shelves of supermarkets, for example?
Well, first of all, I think what the Labour government has done to farmers is absolutely shocking. It means that, according to DEFRA's figures, something like 3/4 of farmers are not going to be able to leave their farms to their children or their grandchildren. And these are farmers that, they're not well off particularly. They're often actually struggling to make ends meet because farming is not very profitable these days. And of course, we rely on farmers for our food security. So the fact that Labour has declared war on farmers is obviously bad for farmers, but it's actually bad for all of us because it'll undermine our food security and Trevor, it'll increase our food prices.
We understand the case. And in fact, I'm going to be talking to the boss of the NFU later on. But what about their tactics? Is the Conservative Party comfortable with farmers essentially doing what French farmers have been doing for years, which is threatening to block up roads, threatening to make people uncomfortable and hungry and so on?
Well, I think people have a right to protest, and obviously we respect the right to protest within the law. So, and it's up to Parliament to set where the law sits. So I think providing they're behaving lawfully, legally, then they do have a right to protest. And I understand why they feel so strongly, because their livelihoods are threatened. But moreover, it's likely that food prices for the rest of us are going to go up as a result of Labour's assault on farmers.
Yeah, but you, actually, one of the things that you lot banged on a lot about when you were in government was disruptive protest. Surely you should be wagging your finger at the farmers as well now. This is just Stop Oil, only with barber boots on.
Well, I said within the law. Now, if they're going to have a protest and come to the centre of London to protest, as many groups do and many groups have over the years, then that is lawful and that is reasonable. What Just Stop Oil were doing was repeatedly, again and again and again, deliberately blocking roads, not as part of a protest, but simply to inconvenience the public, and that is different. That is unlawful. All right,
let's talk about another issue which has exercised your leader. She's called for a review of hate crime laws. Now, you were Minister for Crime for the last 2 years of the Conservative government. Didn't you notice that people's collars were being felt by the police for what they called hate speech? And why didn't you do something about it then?
Well, I did. It did concern me, and I did do something, because the police should not be acting as the thought police, particularly in relation to journalists, but actually more widely as well. Free speech is very important. We have a criminal threshold, and the police should only get involved where that criminal threshold is met. If they're looking at non-criminal incidents, that should be extremely rare, and it should only happen where there is a real risk of imminent criminality. That's a very high threshold. So I was concerned, and I did take action, together with the then Home Secretary, which was to restrict the circumstances in which the police could record people's personal details for these so-called non-crime hate incidents. And I had intended to go further, but for the election. And what concerns me is that the new Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, is apparently planning to undo those changes that I made a few months ago.
Do you not accept her case, which is that recording non-crime hate incidents is in principle important if we are to chart the rise and fall of this kind of prejudice?
Well, of course, things like, anti-Semitism and other forms of hatred are recorded by all kinds of organisations. The police should only be recording this kind of information, which falls below the criminal threshold, if there is a real and imminent risk of criminality following. Because for a start, if someone gets a full criminal record check done, that will get disclosed. Now, some cases have been reported this week by The Times, for example, where 9-year-old children were getting their details recorded as non-crime hate incidents for things happening in playgrounds. A Telegraph journalist, a different Telegraph journalist, said they were investigated for making comments on the trans debate. Now, that is wrong. People should have the right to free speech, and the police should not be policing thought.
Your leader used the word trivial in respect of what I think she meant some of these kinds of complaints. Anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim prejudice, trivial?
No, they're not trivial. They're very serious indeed. And inciting racial or religious hatred is rightly a criminal offence under Section, I think, 17 of the Public Order Act. But things like, what children say in playgrounds, journalists participating in the trans debate. That latter point is about free speech, particularly for journalists, but actually for everybody as well. And the police should not be wasting time and resources policing thought. They should be concentrating on criminality.
The House of Commons is shortly to have a debate on the bill brought forward by Kim Leadbitter on physician-assisted death. Will you support it?
So first of all, it's important to make clear this is a free vote, so the political parties do not have a position, and so my view is a personal one. It's not one on behalf of the opposition or my party. And I think, by the way, Wes Streeting was quite naughty earlier this week to use his position as Health Secretary to make government arguments
don't make
on one
it partisan.
side.
I'm asking about you.
But in terms of my personal view, look, there's two things to balance up here. One is our regard for the sanctity of life. Now, I personally do believe in the sanctity of life. I would never want to engage in assisted dying or assisted suicide myself. I wouldn't want my family to. I would never encourage anyone to. But I also respect personal choice and personal liberty. And I don't want to use my the power of my vote in Parliament to stop somebody else exercising a choice in certain very restricted circumstances. So for that reason of personal liberty, and personal choice, providing the safeguards are very, very strong, and the space in which this can be done is quite narrow. So I think it's, last 6 months of life, in pain, no coercion, 2 doctors sign it off, a judge and so on. I would be prepared to support this on the grounds that I respect other people's right to make their own choice, even though it's a choice I myself would, I hope, never make. Okay. I would never encourage any of my friends or family to do so, because I do believe in the sanctity of life, but I also believe in people's personal choice and personal liberty, and that's how I will, I think, balance up those two very difficult competing considerations.
Chris Philp, thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Back to our panel, Cindy Yu, Salma Shah and Sonia Soda. Cindy, news dropped literally in the last half hour. 1,000 people crossed the channel in small boats over the past week. Whatever it is they're doing, not working, is it really?
No, I mean, we always used to say that there was a seasonal effect on the numbers across the channels, and the seasonal effect is meant to work better in the winter when it's cold, but if there's still 1,000 people coming over in the last week, I defer to Sharma, but that's a very high number. And I think that's always been immigration has always been a tricky issue for Labour in this government. Before the election, they didn't really have to answer serious questions on it because the Tories were doing so badly anyway, as with many other policy areas. But since scrapping Rwanda, they haven't really had a good answer to what is the deterrent effect on that. It's all well and good to talk about smashing the people smuggling gangs, but what about the people themselves who still want to come over here? That deterrent effect has not been talked about. And so, this new deal that you've been talking to Louise, Haigh and Chris Philp about this morning, we'll need to see the details of that. In terms of, if you're targeting Kurdistan, how much can you really get to the heart of the people smuggling gangs there? If you're targeting Vietnam, it's the third largest source of new immigrants now, but what does that really do? I mean, it depends on a lot of the detail. And how much money will all of this cost? Because if Italy is the model here, Italy sent tens of millions of euros over to Northern African countries in order to do this. Back to Sonia's point about the poor fiscal inheritance, do we have the money to do this?
There's a sort of rather pejorative way of putting this idea that the government's come up with, which is we're about to bribe the governments of other countries to hold on to people who would otherwise want to leave.
Well, there's that, and there's also the risk of what we're actually going to be paying for, and what does sort of penning people in look like. It's not just about smashing gangs. What if it's used against citizens that are defying their governments? What kind of
asylum seekers.
Exactly, legitimate asylum seekers or refugees that are potentially moving. What are the controls that we would then have on the way that money is spent? And this is not about aid and actually, some of the lack of controls that actually exist with foreign aid that we're sending. All of that would be compounded by this. I'm not saying that this isn't an option. I do, and I've always accepted and made the point that things like climate change, things like conflict are actually going to make these migration patterns more difficult in the long term. The difficulty here is actually how are we going to work this out? How is this going to change the way we think about immigration?
A lot of what Salma's just said actually chimes with me, which is that I think we've always lived in a world where there are irregular movements of people. And the truth is they fluctuate and they're going up at the moment. And they are very, very difficult to stop, actually, because they are mostly driven by push factors than pull factors. And so governments, the Tories said, we've got this great scheme, Rwanda, we're going to stop the crossings. Now Labour are exploring other options, which I think do raise questions about human rights abuses, because you've seen countries like Tunisia basically use EU money to perpetrate human rights abuses. But I think it's better than the Rwanda plan in the sense sense that it's upstream. But the truth is Labour doesn't know how to stop these crossings either. The EU doesn't really know how to stop these crossings. No government really knows how to stop people crossing the Mediterranean or the Channel, and they can invest more in trying to stop it. But I also think there needs to be an honest conversation with voters. Governments don't like doing this, but it's genuinely really hard.
Well, we are not going to stop talking about it, I imagine, but we are going to stop talking here for a moment. After the break, the Church of England's... This has been the Church of England's most damaging week in years. The Bishop of Newcastle alleges some of her colleagues are putting their careers ahead of holding the leadership to account.
And now it's coming from both sides and it's moving this way.
Only about half a mile from the Turkish coast, and it's evident that the boat seriously overcrowded. This is one of the most severe viruses in the world.
I'm Alex Crawford and I'm Sky's special correspondent based in Istanbul.
The biggest party Tripoli has ever seen.
That's it. It got us then.
There's a lot of action going on, a lot of hits going in still. We aim to be the best and the most trusted place in news. Clearly not had very much to eat at all, a lot of them extremely thin and very frail. Look at her arms. I can put my entire hand round. This is the cocktail of drugs which the doctors at this hospital have been giving their coronavirus patients. Made for people who want clarity in an uncertain world.
Mother Nature can be vicious, absolutely savage.
The world's largest falls now down to a trickle in places.
I can't imagine how much plastic is lying at the bottom of this huge lake. Whoa! Close and personal with her owner.
This is what makes the job so fantastic.
We've got your Sunday mornings covered. From the front page and the sounds of the streets to the voices of the people who make the major calls and big picture politics beyond Westminster. We'll put you at the heart of our story. A new start to Sunday. I'm ready. Are you? Join me, Trevor Phillips, Sunday mornings on Sky News.
We arrive. A secret hospital hidden in the Myanmar jungle, treating the victims of this bloody war. This is Myanmar today. Its military rulers don't want the world to see, but we have.
I fight for my own future. I fight for my generation's future.
This is an actual crime.
They don't care for that.
Myanmar army is only a couple of kilometers away. So this is a major humanitarian disaster.
Day of this conflict.
They keep telling us that they want aid.
And this is what's left of it.
Why only in America?
People want their country to work.
Just want a job in a normal life.
Why are these homes empty?
I want you to be honest with people.
That has happened within minutes.
Sky News, the full story first. Free wherever you get your news.
Play Sky News.
From the Sky News Centre at 7.
Now that you're up to date, we can go into a bit more detail.
Things can change incredibly quickly.
Taken by surprise.
Have you ever known a moment like this in British politics before? Yes. Cheers.
We'll start with breaking news.
Let's get the latest on the ground.
So, by the end, we'll hopefully all understand what's going on in the world just that little better.
Sundays are often a time for pause and reflection. And on this Sunday, it's the Church of England reflecting more than most. This week saw the downfall of the Archbishop of Canterbury over a damning independent review into the Church's handling of historic child abuse. The only bishop to demand that he stand down was the Bishop of Newcastle. And in a major intervention on this programme, she called for all public officials criticised in the review to resign from the Church. She also alleges a culture of fear and careerism is preventing some bishops from criticising its leadership. I spoke to Dr. Helen-Ann Hartle yesterday. Bishop Helen-Ann, you were the first and so far only bishop to call for the Archbishop of Canterbury to resign. Why are you a lone voice?
I was motivated to call for the Archbishop's resignation, firstly because anybody reading the Macon report would be rightly horrified by its contents and the role of senior clergy in covering up the abuse. And I was also motivated by the letter that I received previous to the publication of the review from both archbishops, which I think spoke deeply to the culture of power and control in the Church. And I thought I would be joined by colleagues who I knew privately were discerning that it was probably the right thing for the Archbishop to resign. And I think it's a great disappointment to me that when I called for that publicly, I was indeed a lone voice. So I have no real explanation for that, other than there is a culture, I think, of silence and fear amongst the bishops, which is really unhealthy.
What are they afraid of?
I think that silence speaks in many ways. Some are silent perhaps because they see themselves as succeeding to be the new Archbishop of Canterbury. Others are fearful of being reprimanded and rebuked, because I know that colleagues have received letters similar to mine, which are quite heavy in tone. So I think genuinely they're motivated by a fear of just keeping their heads down and not feeling able to speak out, which I think is really unfortunate. And this current situation has really blown the lid on that and many other aspects of unhealthy culture.
Well, let's unpack some of that. I mean, first of all, what you seem to be saying to me is that this is a senior hierarchy, if you like, infected by straightforward careerism, that people won't do what they should do because they're looking forward to the next job. Is that right?
I think there will be some thinking like that, unfortunately, and I mean, I know that from informal conversations with colleagues. I think others are just used to keeping their heads down and getting on with the job at hand, which is fair enough, but there are times when a prophetic voice is needed and we do have to stand up. And I think also fear and silence can be complicit with some unhealthy theologies that I think are at the heart of church life over many decades, which tend to problematise things like gender and sexuality and ethnicity, and all of that is in the mix at the moment. And as I said, Macon has really blown the lid off a lot of that dysfunction.
I want to come to the point about your letter, but you've said that this weekend is Safeguarding Sunday. You quoted in one of your messages the book of Proverbs, which says that Christians are enjoined to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. Are you saying that many of your colleagues essentially are not fulfilling their Christian duty?
I think my colleagues do a really fantastic job at the local level, and let's face it, being a bishop or being a leader in public life is challenging and not easy at times. I think it's really deeply ironic that Safeguarding Sunday has a theme of let's talk about it, which is precisely what the church tries to do, but I think doesn't do well enough. And sometimes we can be held back by fear, and that fear leads to silence when we can say things in private and then not vocalise that in public. And that's, for me, that's disappointing.
Do you think that silence is a signal that the church's hierarchy, aside from people's own personal interests, may be placing the church's own reputation above or ahead of the suffering of those who were abused by John Smythe and indeed others like him?
Well, the Macon Review indeed has shone a light on the horrendous abuse perpetrated by John Smythe and the way in which the church, particularly people in senior posts, covered that up, allowed the abuse to continue and did not intervene at a point when that abuse could have stopped. And I think that has exposed the church's continual failings to victims and survivors. And in a sense, what we've seen, or what I've seen and heard in the last few days, is a kind of re-traumatising of those victims and survivors because the church hierarchy has failed to act in the way it should have done. And so the reputational risk is immense, both looking out into the world, some of the messages I've had from people in public life and in civic positions of leadership, but also I think more critically the reputational impact looking in on clergy who work incredibly hard in parishes, parish safeguarding officers. Their morale has really been impacted seriously, both by the Macon Review and the response to it in the past few days. And so that reputational risk, I think, is critical at this time.
You referred to the letter that you received from the Archbishop of Canterbury and Archbishop of York, which I think we don't need to get into the details of it, but asked you essentially to not to do certain things. But the point is that you made about the tone of it, that it was coercive. I just want to ask you, how high is this culture of fear, of careerism and so on that you're talking about? How high in the church does that go?
I've heard anecdotally that a number of my colleagues have received letters that are similar in tone, and I can only speak from my own experience in terms of how I read the letter and how it impacted me. It felt like it was coercive language. And I don't know any further than that, other than to say how it impacted me. But I suspect that this is not the first time that such a letter has been written. And the tone of it has been such that it represents, I think, an unhealthy use of power and control. I mean, the fact that the letter addresses me by my first name, I don't have a problem with that. But it's signed by both archbishops using their full titles. And a number of the phrases used in the letter, I think it was deliberately written so as to coerce me into a particular view that is one that I would want to challenge in that regard.
When you looked at the Macon report, you will have seen, like everybody else, that there were others mentioned who would be, if I can use the word, culpable in a similar way to the Archbishop of Canterbury. Do you want further resignations to follow?
I think anybody who's named in the report who is shown to have failed in the highest standards expected in response to abuse and reporting of abuse, anybody named in the report who still occupies public office or a role in the national church, I think they ought to step down, yes.
So you would call for further resignations?
Yes, on the grounds that the Archbishop of Canterbury has resigned. And I do think that there is a question about what resignation actually means in that regard. I think if any clergy person in my diocese had been shown to have committed serious safeguarding errors, I would have either expected them to or asked them to step down immediately. It is not clear currently what status the Archbishop of Canterbury has. The
position of the Church of England has to some extent been, I guess, damaged by this episode. The bishops will once again be in the spotlight soon, but as the House of Commons enters debate about the issue of assisted dying, will you personally support or oppose the proposed legislation to allow for assisted dying?
So I've gone on record for some time now as being opposed to assisted dying, and in this case it is physician-assisted suicide. For a number of years I was a bishop in New Zealand where they were debating that issue, which was resolved by referendum, and I worked in the context of being a bishop there to oppose that legislation, and I would do so here again if it were to reach the House of Lords. I would continue to speak against it, largely because I don't think the assurances around safeguarding are watertight. I think it's very difficult to assess whether somebody can be seen as being coerced into agreeing to end their own life. I think it's difficult to assess whether somebody has up to 6 months left. Sometimes people live much longer than that. I think what we need is a better investment in palliative care, and we also need to not try and legislate for something like this through a private member's bill, which has minimal debate and minimal scrutiny. It's not the way to do it.
So to be clear, your opposition is, in a sense, pragmatic rather than fundamental. You would say that were conditions right, this is something that might be contemplated, rather than resting entirely on, I guess, what one might call the sixth commandment opposition, thou shalt not kill.
I should say I'm very firmly opposed to any attempt to introduce either physician-assisted suicide or voluntary euthanasia, or however you want to call it. I'm very opposed to it. I think there are two issues here. One is the principled response to the bill, and the other is the mechanism by which is the best way to have a debate. I'm absolutely up for a debate, and I think that's the right of Parliament to have that debate. But I personally don't feel that a private member's bill is the safest mechanism to have that debate. But in any circumstance, I would not support any move to that at all.
Let me just ask you lastly, if I may, the issue may, as you say, come to the House of Lords. And, of course, there's a group of bishops who are in the House of Lords as of right. I suppose the question that many might be asking this morning is, why is it that the group of people who represent what is now a minority interest in England and Wales continue to have such a privileged place in our lawmaking? Is it time for the bishops, the Lords Spiritual, essentially to go the way of hereditary peers who've now been removed from the House of Lords?
Well, speaking as one of those 26 Lords Spiritual, I can only speak from my experience in the sense of I received a writ of summons to become a member of the House of Lords as a Lord Spiritual, and I had to respond to that. And I seek to use that role to the best of my ability to speak into critical issues of the day, particularly through the context, the geographical context of which I'm a bishop, the northeast of England. And my sense from those both inside and outside of the parliamentary context is that the bishops are considered to have a valued and valuable voice. We're not whipped in any way. We have to retire at 70. So these are some of the aspects of reform that may be introduced into the House. And I think it's not for me to decide whether bishops are or are not in the House of Lords. That's for the House to determine. But as I see it, and as I sit in the House, I can only see value that I seek to add to any debate and discussion, and I myself value that opportunity.
Bishop Helen-Ann, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
We approached the Church of England for a response to the allegations in that interview. They didn't have anything to add. A spokesperson for the Archbishop of York said this: "The Archbishop is saddened that his letter is being described as coercive. This was not his intention, nor did he mean to cause any distress to the Bishop of Newcastle. The Archbishop of York continues to be committed to further independence for safeguarding within the Church of England, the independent scrutiny of safeguarding, and a much better victim-centred and trauma-informed approach to the culture of safeguarding within the Church of England." Well, coming up, will farmers really stop supplying supermarkets in protest over the budget? We'll speak to the President of the National Farmers Union straight after this.
this conflict.
They keep telling us that they want aid.
And this is what's left of it.
Tanks, heavy vehicle.
Why only in America?
People want their country to work.
You want a job in a normal life.
Why are these homes empty?
I want you to be honest with people.
That has happened within minutes.
Sky News, the full story first. Free wherever you get your news.
As the dust settles on the budget, one measure keeps rumbling louder than a tractor's engine. The Chancellor says she'll raise cash by applying inheritance tax to farms worth over £1 million. Yet farmers warn it will devastate the industry and are already marching in force to protest. But just how far will those protests go? I can speak now to the President of the National Farmers Union, Tom Bradshaw. Good morning, Mr. Bradshaw.
Good morning.
The Farmer Minister has apparently said this morning that your members should be calm. Are you feeling calm?
I think the industry is feeling betrayed, feeling angry. The government said that this wouldn't happen. And then the very ill-considered actions, the lack of understanding of what this means. They keep on saying 73% of farms won't be impacted. But when you look at the farms that are producing the country's food, a significant proportion of those farms, DEFRA's own figures suggest 66%, are over the £1 million threshold. And these are farms that are producing the country's food.
But the truth is that actually, as far as the government's concerned, this is a matter of behaviour, that farmers do have the choice. They can decide to pass on the asset 7 years before the owner dies. They can use the allowances for a couple or civil partners. There are ways in which the impact of this can be softened, aren't there?
For some farms there are, but there's two challenges here. Firstly, that the margins that we've been making from food production are so low, any liquid cash that's been available has been reinvested in the farm businesses to try and deliver for food production for the next generation. One of the immediate changes is that farms are going to have to start putting money into their pensions, which many haven't previously done. They're going to have life insurance policies in case of a sudden death. And unfortunately, that was cash that would previously have been invested in producing the country's food for the future. The other very, very serious unintended consequence is the human impact. It's all well and good saying if you're going to live for 7 years, you've got time to pass the asset down. Unfortunately, until lunchtime on the 30th of October, the very best tax advice was that you should keep the farm as an asset until death. That changed within the second the Chancellor made the announcement. And unfortunately, there are many who already have lost a spouse, that are in the twilight of their careers, that have given everything to producing this country's food, and they have absolutely no way to plan through that. That is the betrayal that I'm talking about. The human impact of this is simply not acceptable.
I think nobody could argue with the issues to do with the individual cases, but governments have to choose. Do you have any sympathy with the Prime Minister and Chancellor's case that they had to fill a black hole from the actions of the previous government?
I have a sympathy with the fact that they needed to balance the books. What I don't see is that the 500 or so million pounds they say they're going to raise from this tax is a good foundation for taking that tax from the country, from the people that are going to produce the country's food. We all know that we're living in a time of global insecurity, the geopolitical challenge. We see what's happening in the Ukraine, in the Middle East. We know what's happening with climate change. We have a government saying food security is a critical part of national security, yet they've ripped the rug out from that very industry which is going to invest in food security for the future. There must be a better way of them doing this.
But do you accept that, everybody in one way or another, national insurance, risers and all the rest of it, is going to have to pay? The idea of passing on assets worth £1 million or more lies beyond the wildest dreams of most people. Why should farmers' assets be protected?
And look, this is a really difficult conversation. I recognise you may have people watching today that struggle to be able to afford the weekly shop or the daily shop. And that is a really, really challenging situation. The budget is already inflationary for food production. When you look at the national insurance increases, the national living wage increases, it is going to drive up food inflation significantly. This is another element. The agricultural property relief and business property relief changes will mean that farms are not investing for food production for the future. It will increase the volatility of food production, and it won't deliver the food security that this country needs. So I have huge sympathy for the very, very challenging situations that are facing many people. It just feels like this is an incredibly blunt instrument that really isn't looking at the long-term future of this country and how we provide the food that everybody needs.
You are planning, if you like, an escalating protest. How soon will we see shelves in the supermarkets being emptied?
On Tuesday, we have nearly 2,000 farmers coming to meet their MPs, to sit opposite them, to tell them from the heart what this means for them, their family, their farm, their future. There'll also be a rally taking place alongside that, being coordinated by a group of farmers, where there may be 10 or 20,000 people. We saw in Wales yesterday that farmers were demonstrating outside the Welsh Labour Conference. I have never seen the united sense of anger that there is in this industry today. And I fully recognise why people want to take further action. I understand that it feels like a bitter blow on top of so many other issues that the industry's been facing.
I'm hearing your point about farmers' anger, but if you empty the shelves, there will be people who go hungry. What about them?
No, look, again, I don't for one moment condone that anyone will stop supplying the supermarkets. We saw during the COVID crisis that those unable to get their food were often either the very most vulnerable or those that have been working long hours in hospitals, the nurses. That is something we do not want to see again. But this is in the government's control. They can sit down, they can talk to us, they can work our way through this.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I just want to get one thing clear, because some farmers were telling Sky News yesterday that this was the plan, that they want people to know what it's like if farmers are not producing, that to understand that there will be hunger, there will be shortages. Are you saying this is not an NFU tactic?
That is not an NFU tactic. We do not support emptying supermarket shelves, but I do completely understand the strength of feeling that there is amongst farmers. They feel helpless today, and they're trying to think of what can they do to try and demonstrate what this means to them. So, look, I understand their strength of feeling, but we are not supporting that action.
Tom Bradshaw, the National Farmers Union, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
In just a moment, we'll hear once again from our panel.
Migrants risk their lives climbing aboard these trains in search of a dream, the United States.
It's really dangerous. They often get robbed on this train.
They suffer a lot, by police, cartels.
What happens to them next, we just don't know. Do you miss your mum?
With Trump coming to the presidency, how much longer will people be accommodated?
The journey you've been through, it's been very difficult at times. Has it been worth it?
See.
This is a journey which goes by one name, the Beast.
First Minister, how are you?
Good morning. Good morning.
Nice to see you.
How are you feeling? Looking forward to getting into the parliamentary chamber.
Are you any further forward to making a decision?
No, it's an important day today.
All of the claims were in line with my parliamentary duties, so I'm making that clear to you, Conor.
He was a Scot through and through.
He was a very good politician.
Alex Salmond was controversial, he was a disruptor, but above all, he was respected.
Will you resign if you lose this week?
Again, I'm not planning to, of course, lose the vote of no confidence. I'm planning to win that vote of no confidence.
His face said it all.
My intention to stand down as party leader.
This is now a storm with deadly consequences. How are they feeling?
They're a bit scared at the minute.
We've been told to evacuate.
How are you feeling?
Devastated.
Hundreds of homes were wiped out by flooding. I'm Conor Gillis, Sky's Scotland correspondent.
It was probably the darkest time in my life.
Scott is 5 years sober after a cocaine addiction left him close to death. Scotland has a shameful record, worse than England, the worst in Europe.
Why not just say you failed? Because then you might get more respect
from families who've lost loved ones. This is where one of the UK's most prolific rapists thought he'd got away with murder. Sky News can reveal that former sex workers had told police he was sexually violent.
My Emma.
Free wherever you get your news. It's over, isn't it? The Americans say he is Rossi, a fraudster. This has been one of the most bizarre cases ever heard in a courtroom in this country. A dangerous murderer. Do you think you'll ever be able to forgive Andrew Innes after this?
She said she can forgive him, but as long as he's behind bars.
By doing the right thing, it's destroyed your life.
They terrorised me. They intimidated me.
Sky News, the full story first.
The most significant day of this conflict.
They keep telling us that they want aid.
And this is what's left of it.
Tanks, heavy vehicle.
Why only in America?
People want their country to work.
Just want a job in a normal life.
Why are these homes empty?
I want you to be honest with people.
That has happened within minutes.
Sky News, the full story first. Free wherever you get your news.
We arrive. A secret hospital hidden in the Myanmar jungle, treating the victims of this bloody war. This is Myanmar today. Its military rulers don't want the world to see, but we have.
I fight for my own future. I fight for my generation's future.
This is an actual crime.
They don't care for that.
Myanmar army is only a couple of kilometers away. So this is a major humanitarian disaster.
Well, let's check in with our panel one final time this morning. Cindy Yu, Salma Shah and Sonia Soda are back with me. Sonia, what do you think the public's going to be on the farmers' protests? Sympathetic or a bit sceptical because of the amount of money involved?
I think it sort of depends on the impact that it has on the public as well. So if we start to see sort of protests reaching a level where, you know, they might be impacting on food prices or whatever, then I think the public might turn against farmers. But it's going to be interesting to see it play out. I think that the stories that farmers tell can be quite powerful and can resonate, actually. And that is the issue that the government have got to think about, because when you've got people saying, this means that I can't pass, you know, we've been working very hard and this means I can't pass on the family farm, that is a story that resonates. And the government case in opposition to that is, it's a bit harder to make that emotional case, which is basically about tax avoidance. So I think it could have some purchase, but it will only go so far.
Well, Sonia talks about tax avoidance. I talk about tax efficiency, especially for such an important. As
Spot the Conservative.
Or sometimes you, I think, on certain issues. But with Cindy, it's talking about the productive part of the economy. One of the unsung Whitehall departments is DEFRA. I don't think people...
Department for...
Environment and Rural Affairs.
Thank you so much.
But one of the things that I think is missing from the public consciousness, and, quite often, things like this, because they're affecting a particular group of people, don't necessarily resonate with everyone more widely until you rightly say it starts to affect them. And they may have a negative view because how many people have £1 million worth of assets? But the reality is, what farmers have to do, the regulations that they have to endure, what they're having to do in terms of biodiversity, climate, food production, increasing costs, that's a really hard job. And I think that the unintended consequences aren't just about the taxation system or what happens when they're handing something down in that personal story. It is actually about how our land is being cultivated and how it's being looked after. And I don't think that that sits in the public consciousness in the way that it could or should.
And the inheritance tax issue does have a sort of emotional impact. The public's divided on it. And I gather that the 24% of people support basically cutting back on inheritance tax or making the inheritance tax regime tighter, and 40% say leave it alone.
Absolutely, and I think everyone has an opinion on it because it is quite easy to understand. It's a part of life where, even if you don't have the assets to take you above that threshold, family members who will have passed away and, you have thoughts on whether or not they will leave you things. But I actually think this you know, for the government to think that farming is a part of the inheritance tax discussion, that's where I have a problem with that, because farming, you know, going back to the point about the productive force, it is an industry, and actually it's an industry which doesn't really encourage new people to come in, because it's really hard to get people, you know, it's one of the last sectors of manual labour, essentially. You know, nobody young who doesn't come from a farming family thinks, I want to be a farmer tomorrow. You know, it's very, very rare to do that. So you have to pass it down through the generations and make sure that your children and don't kind of go out and look for jobs elsewhere if we want to have a farming industry in this country.
OK, we'll see. Well, we've run the whole programme pretty much from beginning to now and not mentioned the story that has preoccupied us once, and it's summed up in one word: Trump. This week has been the week of Donald Trump's nominees. And I think we've got a picture of the story so far, and I'm going to ask you, Salma, what you make of his picks. We can obviously talk about Robert Kennedy and the chap who, Matt Gaetz, who was under investigation. He was a congressman and he was under investigation and so on. But what are you making of it?
There is, amongst all the sort of commentary of the madness of some of the people that are here, there is a very clear logic in my mind. And this is a team of people who distrust everything that has gone before, who challenge, who are completely external, who do not take the established view of everything. Elon Musk is a classic example of that. RFK Jr., you know, sort of being an anti-vaxxer, wanting to challenge drug companies and food companies. I think it's really interesting that logic is really strong. I would also say that I understand why he's done it. There is almost a positive that even I can see, which is the things that people are upset about is not about RFK's anti-vaccine stance. That's what people like me would be upset about. What people like is that he's talking about healthy food for Americans. He's talking about health for Americans. Yeah. And that actually is the side of the ledger that we don't necessarily give enough attention to, because that is what appeals to people. And I think that is why President-elect Trump has decided to go for this maverick group of people that might have people's trust against the establishment.
This is a shake-it-up kind of cabinet, isn't it?
It very much is, but you look at someone like, you know, Tulsi Gabbard, to pick another one, and some of the things that she said in terms of Russia-Ukraine. I mean, she seems to lean more towards a kind of, you know, pro-Russian take on the world. Kind of quite scary when you think...
She used to be a Democrat.
Yeah. I know. And, you know, she's sort of made quite an extraordinary transition in politics, shall we say. I think this is... You know, it's a scary group of people if you're interested in what Trump's going to do, I think, and the fact that he's, you know, got the House, he's got the Senate, he's got a Conservative majority on the Supreme Court. There are fewer factors limiting him, and I think here in the UK we should be looking at this group of people and saying, what does this mean for our place in the world? Actually, it means we need to be doing everything we can to build better diplomatic and economic ties with the EU, because we cannot rely on President Trump to sort of offer us, you know, a favoured trade deal. That's not what he's in it for. He's in it for America.
Indeed. Cindy, the one I'm most interested in the top right-hand corner, Susie Wiles, the Chief of Staff. Now, of course, people are going to make a big deal of the fact that she is the first woman ever to occupy that. But I think, actually, the most important thing is that this is a woman of steel.
I think you're forgetting CJ Craig.
Oh, right. OK, obligatory West Wing reference. But this is a woman who is the Trump whisperer. Insofar you can get him under control, she managed to do it. And I don't suppose you would ever want to have an argument with her.
No, and she first came into the public eye when Trump introduced her on stage, very against her will, calling her the Ice Maiden. You know, yeah. Susie, come up here. And Susie's like, no, I don't want to come up here at all. But she's won him Florida. You know, she's made Florida Republican through her time as a strategist. And she's clearly, you know, a very calm, stable pair of hands. So I think, you know, back to your point, to your introduction, the first Trump presidency, we know how that turned out. There was a lot of turnover with the advisors, people he fell out with. You know, Scaramucci was in there for 6 days, I think it was. With an experienced operator like her, you do wonder how consolidated it now will be. If I can say one more thing about that stands to me about this cabinet is the foreign policy part. I'm not surprised that he chose Tulsi Gabbard because he does want to get closer to Russia. Mm-hmm. And that's all in order to fight China better. And so Marco Rubio and Tulsi Gabbard make sense together.
I was just going to say that what I find really interesting about this is that, you know, in the first administration, his chief of staff was Rance Priebus, who was a real kind of Republican stalwart and, you know, somebody you would expect to have that role. So even though they're in place now, even though he seems to have a better understanding of what he wants, we can't rule out the possibility that there are going to be some changes to this throughout the presidency.
Well, indeed, he got rid of 4 chiefs of staff in his first term.
And he also does use his advisors as leverage, as cover as well. You know, he talked about John Bolton in that 3-hour Joe Rogan podcast recently, and he said, you know, you walk into a diplomatic negotiation with John Bolton, he just scares everyone. John scares everyone, and I can be the good cop, you know, were essentially his meaning. So is Marco Rubio just there to scare China, and then he can be the one to come in and strike a deal, and then when Marco Rubio, you know, outlasts his use, will he be replaced by someone else? Do
you agree with me, very briefly, that this looks actually like a more effective team, but in some ways, for some people, makes it more scary? OK. You know?
Look, all untested. Let's.
All right. That is it for this week's show. I'll be back next Sunday, 08:30.